put together these two talks by faculty members working in the same period, so the 18th century, because partly to flag up how distinctive their work is in terms of what the opportunities are to do such different things within the same period. And I hope that will be of interest as well. So we'll move on now to Professor Adam Smyth, who's going to speak on literature's material forms. Hi, Adam, I can see you.
Hey, am I
Welcome.
audible and visible?
Welcome. You absolutely are, yes. And I'll
Good.
just say that Adam is Professor of English Literature and the History of the Book at Oxford. And his most recent book is The Bookmakers, A History of the Book in 18 Remarkable Lives. And it's just come out in 2024. And you can also hear it on audio. Adam reads it on an audio version I just learned. And he's currently edited Shakespeare's Pericles for Arden Drama. So thank you. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. Thanks everyone for being here. I can't see all your faces, but I know you're out there. So welcome, and it's nice to be able to talk to you. Kirsten, I'm doing that terrifying thing of sharing my screen. So let's see if we can do this. So if you can tell me if
Nothing's happening so far, but I'm sure it will.
I like your optimism. Okay, now
That looks
how about
promising.
that?
Yes. Brilliant.
Can you see a whole PowerPoint screen?
I can. Yep.
Okay,
Literature's
great.
material forms. I
Um,
think you're good to go.
okay, let me see, because um, I can't see that now.
Oh,
Share.
I think if you just press share at the bottom.
Yeah. Is that changing screen?
Yep, that looks
Great.
good.
So that says Literature's Material Forms. Professor Adam Smyth, that's me. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the forms in which literary writing circulated across a few centuries, actually. Kirsten said that Ros and I are in the same period, and we're kind of in the 16th, 17th, 18th century period. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about texts in that period and beyond. I'll talk a little bit about Shakespeare, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Dickens to end with. And the refrain, the thing running through these three case studies is what we get as literary critics, as literary readers, as people passionate about literary writing, what we get when we think about the ways in which writing was produced and circulated and read in its original moments. If we go back to the earliest printed text of a Shakespearean play, say, or if we look at how Dickinson wrote, or if we look at the ways in which Charles Dickens's novels circulated in the 1860s, how does that help us as literary readers? I'm not trying to turn people into librarians or archivists, although those are very noble pursuits, of course. I'm trying to suggest that as literary critics, we can gain a lot from thinking about these original material forms, so the ways in which literature moves through the world. Really, I guess there's a corrective or an alternative to the tidy, modern, Arden, Penguin, Norton editions that we typically rely on for good reasons. So those are great things in terms of getting the text into the hands of pupils and students and readers. But if we put those tidy, modernized, regularized editions to the side for a moment and go back to the original material forms, what new opportunities for thinking about these texts opens up? Okay, so I'm going to begin with the canon, the center of the canon, I guess, at least as it's normally understood with Shakespeare. And you've got two Shakespeare texts here. Perhaps not the most too familiar, but I wanted to show you these for that reason. On the left, we have the first printing of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. And on the right, we have the first printing of Love's Labour's Lost. Titus Andronicus, the Shakespeare's earliest tragedy from 1594, earliest Roman play attributed to Shakespeare, and Love's Labour's Lost, that brilliant, dazzling, very sonnet-informed comedy of confined spaces and wit and courtship and gender. And we're looking at the earliest printings. We're not looking at modern editions, we're looking at the earliest printings here. And we're looking at the title pages in particular. And when plays texts were printed, the title page was the last bit printed. And it often offers a kind of reading of the play that I think is really instructive. It tells, its function was to tell readers what they were going to get, what they should look out for, what was interesting about the play to come. And in fact, they always printed more title pages than there were copies of the book because they stuck them up on posts and boards and inside taverns as forms of advertisement. So my first little case study really is to suggest looking at the title pages of Shakespeare in the original editions is a good thing to do. And there's lots of online resources that can help you do that. I'll show you a link to one in a moment. And they tell us something important and interesting about the play. Let me just substantiate that by looking a little bit at each of these. So you can see them, I'll read these title pages. The most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus. I love the way that lamentable is cut off in that way. As it was played by the Right Honourable the Earl of Derby, Earls of Pembroke, the Earl of Sussex, their servants, London, printed by John Danter, and are to be sold by Edward White and Thomas Millington at the little north door of St Paul's at the sign of the gun, 1594. Okay, Titus Andronicus. On the right, Love's Labour's Lost, a pleasant conceited comedy called Love's Labour's Lost, as it was presented before Her Highness this last Christmas, newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare, imprinted at London by W. for Cuthbert Verby, 1598. Okay, so why do I think it's worth looking at these things? Why are these interesting? Well, let me pull out maybe 5 points here briefly. First of all, on the Titus Andronicus, there's no Shakespeare. There's no mention of Shakespeare. He's not on the title page. That's pretty interesting if we're interested in if we're thinking about the cultural place of Shakespeare, how dominant he is now, and when he in culture emerged as a kind of irresistible point of definition for his plays. He's not even on the title page in 1594. He starts to appear on title pages when he becomes an attractive selling commodity in 1598 in Richard II, Richard III, and Love's Labour's Lost, as they were printed in that year. They begin to put Shakespeare on the title page. But not before that. In fact, on Love's Labour's Lost, he's introduced in this rather kind of modest form, newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare. Figures him as a kind of editor, almost, rather than the original writer. So there's no bardolatry here in these early printed texts. There's no sense of Shakespeare's kind of cultural dominance. So authorship is interesting here. We get a different version of authorship than we're used to if we look at these title pages. Secondly, and again, kind of fundamentally, basically, what is the title of these two plays? We're used to calling Titus Andronicus, and Love's Labour's Lost, but here we have the most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus and a pleasant conceited comedy called Love's Labour's Lost. It's actually an interesting question. What actually is the title of Love's Labour's Lost? Is it a pleasant conceited comedy called Love's Labour's Lost? Is it Love's Labour's Lost? And also, I always get in a tangle with the apostrophes with Love's Labour's Lost. Is it love apostrophe S, Labour's apostrophe S, Lost? Or is it love apostrophe S, Labour's Lost? And you see different versions in productions, actually. This first printing gives us no clue. There are no apostrophes. We're left in the dark. And hence the confusion in the centuries to come, I think. So these title pages kind of muddle in interesting ways the very idea of the title. What are these plays called? Third thing, briefly, I think we get a really nicely sharp sense of genre from these title pages. Shakespearean criticism is still locked into the first folio from 1623 and the organization of those plays as histories, comedies, tragedies. We've nuanced them a little bit with things like kind of romance or problem plays or late plays even, but still that trio of first folio constructed categories dominate Shakespearean criticism. If you go back to the quartos, so these pre-first folio printings, we get a much more granular, nuanced sense of genre. What does it mean for a play not to just be a tragedy, but to be a lamentable Roman tragedy? And similarly, not just a comedy, but a pleasant, conceited comedy called Love's Labour's Lost. I think it's a really good thing to do to put modern senses of genre against the first folio categories of genre from 1623 against the quartos when we get these super specific kinds of ideas of genre floating around. Fourth thing is I really love the little sketch of the performance history we get in these first printings. So these are plays printed to be read and to be sold as books, but on the title page, there's a little bit of theatrical history. For Titus Andronicus, as it was played by the Right Honourable the Earl of Derby, Pembroke, Sussex. For Love's Labour's Lost, as it was presented before Her Highness this last Christmas. You'll know often in Shakespeare studies, there's a kind of page versus stage dichotomy. There's a kind of criticism which takes these as read text to be closely read, like we might a poem or a novel, and there's a kind of criticism which puts them in the theatre, either the theatre of the early modern period or the theatre subsequently. These early printings entangle those two modes of criticism. They are printed texts to be read, but they carry a memory of performance as they move towards readers. And the final thing I want to mention briefly is Shakespeare's a low-key presence in these early quartos. He's not on Titus Andronicus. He's mentioned in this slightly odd way in Love's Labour's Lost, but there are other kinds of agent present here. In other words, there are other people who have been responsible for bringing this text into being, for launching it into the world, for launching Shakespeare into the world. Titus Andronicus, printed by John Danta, sold by the booksellers White and Millington. And we get a lovely little vivid sense of where their shop is at the little north door of Paul's, at the sign of the gun, around St. Paul's Cathedral, in the churchyard, bookstalls. This is where all these things could be bought. Similarly, Love's Labour's Lost, printed by W.W. for Cuthbert Burby. Cuthbert Burby, the publisher, puts the money up, W.W., the printer. So I'm interested in the way authorship is not the only way these texts define themselves or explain themselves. There are other workers, other agents who are brought into the picture. Okay, so that's my brief case study number one. If we go back to the early printings of these plays, we get a lot of helpful information that can help us say newly precise things about these plays, I think, in terms of genre, the status of Shakespeare, the title, ideas of performance history, and who's responsible for producing these works. And there's the Folger Shakespeare Library is a wonderful resource that lots of you will know, based in Washington, D.C., but with a massive online presence. They've got a lot of stuff on Shakespeare in print on the first folio and the early quartos. That URL there is really helpful in getting you to facsimiles of the kinds of things I was showing you earlier. Okay, great. Moving on a couple of centuries, a few centuries forward, to Emily Dickinson, and to a poem written, a super short poem written in about 1873, when Dickinson's about 43 years old. Dickinson, as you know, extremely prolific writer who regularly enclosed poems in letters to her friends, but not largely or very much publicly recognized during her lifetime. After her death in 1886, the discovery of a huge quantity of something like 1,800 poems, which were then brought together and gathered and edited in various forms and produced in print, and in a edition by Ralph W. Franklin, most famously. So she achieves a staggering posthumous fame, but during her lifetime, not so much. This is her beautiful short poem. In this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power? In this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power? And you can see the credits beneath that poem, which comes from the Online Poetry Foundation, that we typically find it in the Poems of Emily Dickinson, Variorum edition, edited by Ralph Franklin, Cambridge, 1998. But that's not the form in which Dickinson wrote it. And I think there's some virtue in thinking about what she produced as a material text to think about this poem. And this is what she actually wrote. And you can still read it just about, probably. In this short life that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power? The obvious difference, of course, is that we don't get a tidy web page or a 1998 printed hardback edition, but we get a scrap of paper on which this poem is penned or penciled. And that scrap of paper is a bit of an envelope. She's literally writing on the back of an envelope. And Dickinson's, I think, fascinating practice was to be a great recycler of paper. And many of her poems are written on the back of reused, cut open or flattened envelopes. On one side, the address of her address, usually, and on the back, a sketch of a poem, which she produced, as you can see here. Here are a couple of other examples of the same thing. you can see on the left that poem, which some of you will know: "A great hope fell, you heard no noise. The ruin was within. Oh, cunning wreck that told no tale and let no witness in," etc. etc. And you can see again the form of the envelope there. Top right, a letter she received that was flipped and used as a substrate or a kind of skin on which she wrote. And then bottom right, again, gloriously filling the back of an envelope. "'Twas later when the summer went, than when the cricket came. And yet we knew that gentle clock meant naught but going home. 'Twas sooner when the cricket went than when the winter came. Yet that pathetic pendulum keeps esoteric time." Time squeezed in at the bottom, the E of time, to the corner of the page. So I think, and so the first thing to say, this is an interesting mode of writing. She's using and recycling letters she received as the space in which she exercises her wit and writes these poems. And this phenomenon is a kind of a counter to the tidy, edited, printed volume through which we normally encounter Dickens. Big Faber and Faber, huge volume, lots of you will have, which is wonderful and gives us Dickens' genius, but it's not what she wrote. She wrote them as the text that we can see here. On the bottom left of the screen, you can see there's a great book, which is in print, has been reprinted, Emily Dickinson, The Gorgeous Nothings, by Jen Bervin and Martha Werner. Bervin, interestingly, is an artist, a book artist. Martha Werner is a literary scholar and an archivist, textual scholar. And they produced an edition of these Dickinson poems that beautifully reproduces these original envelope forms. So this is how Dickinson wrote many of her poems. This is a kind of corrective or counter to the forms of the way in which we normally encounter them in modern editions. And that really leads to the interesting kind of literary critical question, I suppose, is how is the poem different when it's read in this particular way? And if you show this to a pupil or a student or read it yourself, how is the poem a different thing? How does the material form and the content relate? I mean, I think there's probably lots of ways of answering that question, but the most basic thing to say, I think, probably, is that it looks to me like the material form is what Dickinson is starting with, and then into that space she places her wit. In other words, the poem's shape and length is determined by the envelope on which she's writing. And it may be not that she has an idea for a poem and forms that into a verse and then writes it down, but that she has an envelope or a piece of paper, and that materiality is the basis. And within those constraints, she exercises her wit by writing the poem in this way. So it's rather the other way around than we might think. She begins with a paper, and with that intriguing combination of constraint and liberation, the material form lets her write the poem that she produces. I really, really recommend that Gorgeous Nothings books. I think it's like a really compelling book. But just to place a couple of examples, if you're doing a Dickinson poem, as I've done with students before, just to place the modern edition next to the reproduction of the envelope poem in its original material form, and just to pose that question: what's the difference between the two? Why does this matter? What is the relationship between literary form and material form? Is the shape of the stanza on the page and the working of Dickinson's literary imagination shaped, enabled by the humdrum thing that is the recycled envelope? Okay, so that's number two. So Shakespeare's early printed quartos can give us some insights. Dickinson's envelope poems can perhaps get us to think about her writing process and the links between material form and literary form. Lastly, you'll know that Dickens's novels, such as Great Expectations, appeared in the world, not in the singular doorstoppers that we read today, but as periodical publications, serial publications. They appeared in parts in weekly magazines. And this is just a case study of this. And I want to point you in the direction of a couple of websites that can give you some interesting information about this as another way of reading Dickens and reading 19th century novels. So Dickens's Great Expectations, 1861, you can see that famous first paragraph there, my father's family name, my father's family name being Pirrup, and my Christian name Philip. My infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip. It's really famous opening lines. Great Expectations was originally published as a serial in Dickens's own weekly journal, all the year round. You can see it there on the left. All the year round, a weekly journal conducted by Charles Dickens. I always think it's a nice way of him being described, his agency, with which is incorporated Household Worlds. And this is the beginning, the first part. And it ran from 1st of December 1860 to August 1861, a serial story as it defined itself, week to week, across 8 months and through 36 weekly numbers without illustrations. Interestingly, at the same time, in America, in Harper's Weekly, there was another process of serialization going on, which included lots of woodblock engravings. So there's a nice contrast there between UK and US publication. And ahead of the last month's serial installment, so just when All the Year Round was getting to the end of the story and we're closing in on the end of Great Expectations, Chapman and Hall published the entire story as a triple-decker, a great late 19th century form, the triple-decker novel of 3 parts, 3 volumes in hardback, 31 shillings 6pence for all 3. And each volume corresponding to the 3 stages of the novel from All the Year Round. So we have Dickens's great novel, Great Expectations, reaching the world, circulating the world in these 2 very different forms rather. A weekly, kind of flimsy serial, priced at 2p, and then the monumental, heavy, costly 3-volume version of Great Expectations. And I think it's a really interesting exercise to put, for example, the first couple of paragraphs alongside each other, from the serial publication and then from the triple-decker from 1861, Chapman and Hall, and see what looks different. The words on one level are the same. On the right, my father's family name being Pirrup and my Christian name Philip, ... These are the same words. But we can, I think, make the case that as reading experiences, they're quite distinct. If we're looking at All the Year Round, of course, Great Expectations comes at us surrounded by other things. It's framed by all this paratextual material, paratext meaning the stuff that surrounds a text and ushers it into the world, the title page, the notes, the footnotes, all that kind of stuff. That's paratext. So it's framed as something for 2p. It's pinned to a particular day, Saturday, December the 1st, 1860. That is, it's framed as an occasional publication coming out on a particular day. And the chronology of its serial publication sits in interesting ways, I think, with the chronology of the narrative inside the story. And in All the Year Round, there are other contents as well, if you look through that particular copy, as the title says, with which is incorporated Household Worlds. And also that quote from Shakespeare at the top, the story of our lives from year to year. These all position the narrative in a particular way, occasional, cheap, relevant to our lives, associated with these household worlds. And that's all interesting, I think. On the right, the triple-decker hardback, there's none of that surround. The novel, divided into 3 stages rather than lots and lots of parts, becomes something like an autonomous work. There's no other noise or traffic or chatter of other kinds of text or writing or timescales. It's an imaginative universe in which you can enter into without that kind of surround. So I think it would be an interesting exercise to juxtapose serial with triple-decker publication, think about how these paratextual matters inform the text, and think about how the arc of the narrative is shaped and experienced differently if it's these 36 little small leaps forward versus these 3 great volumes. There's a website there, victorianweb.org, which has been around for a long time online. So it has a slightly kind of dusty aesthetic, but it's really great in terms of having links through to facsimiles of these periodical publications, or if you're interested in lots of things to do with Victorian literature, but particularly publication history. It's got some really helpful stuff. The last thing to say is that's my email there. Do drop me a line if you are interested in this kind of stuff and have questions or anything you want to discuss with me. I'll be happy to do that. But I think I will pause there so we have a little time, I hope, for some questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Absolutely brilliant. And wow, what a couple of talks there that work so well together in terms of context and ways in which we encounter literary works. Sorry about completely misrepresenting your areas of interest and your periods, Adam. I was sort of trying to draw attention to the fact that you and Roz overlap,
Yeah, no,
not
we
to
do.
indicate.
We totally do.
But absolutely, look, you're ranging all the way from the 16th century up to, Dickinson and beyond. So it's brilliant. And that's also one of the things we grapple with at Oxford is the periodization that, for a lot of people, it does feel quite constraining as a way to describe what we do and what our interests are. So just to say, we have a question in the Question&A panel. I would love to read it out. It was on the back of Roz's talk, and there are none yet coming in in addition to that one. Please do put them in if you.
Yeah, I'm trying to, Molly, I don't know if you can put this question in. I can't get it into the open part of the chat. So.
Yeah,
I don't think you can move them back once they've been answered, but everyone can click and should be able to see the answer.
Oh, they can see the answered question.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thank you, Molly.
Well, so how would you like to do it? Shall I read it out and you speak to it, or do you feel because people can see it?
I think it's a good. Well, shall I quickly run through? I was thinking about it as Adam was talking. So it's a really good question, I think, about how do we get our sort of apprentice learners to feel confident about using their own context for analysis, and that students can be secure on the idea of multiple contexts and competing views, but they find it quite difficult to frame personal response as an academic response. And I said two things. One of them is I do think is always about saying to a student, if you keep your nose really close to what you're seeing and reading, you will be bringing your own context, but you need to do that thing of sort of seeing something, thinking about it, and then looking for more evidence to support it from the text, not necessarily going to find another critic to do it for you. But I've also suggested something I do with my first years. I run what I call skills seminars alongside the content that they're studying when they come and learn academic skills. And I have a short seminar I do very early in the course when they first arrive, which is called Where Do I Know From? So not who am I, but where do I know from? Where is my knowledge coming from? And I ask students to talk about the kind of key spurs to their knowledge, books they've long read and loved, family wisdom they've lived by, environments that have taught them about people and the way they live together or apart from them. And then I ask them to share that with the group. It's a great way of them meeting each other. I have a group of about 10 or 12 students starting new each year. And then I ask them to bring that story they've told to one of the texts they're going to work with or have been working with and explore how it might unlock some meanings in that text. Sometimes that's a really good way of sort of, for instance, sometimes I find my students with Islamic backgrounds are really good at thinking through Christianity in modern fiction or in 19th century fiction because they're so imbued with that faith tradition. So these are great ways of making students too feel like they can learn from each other's contexts.
Can I add some? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
I just wanted to add a sort of, I think that I really like all that. And on a kind of bookish level as an equivalent, which is, it's often the case that in a seminar, if we're reading, say, I don't know, Tristram Shandy, the students will come and they'll all have different editions, and some will be scholarly, and some of them will be on their laptops, and some of them will be editions they inherited from their grandparents. And there's a kind of chaos which introduces some problems, like we can't use the same page numbers and we can't look up the same bit. But it does immediately raise interesting questions of how this text is mediated, and questions of paratext and access and imagined and implied readership, and the framing of this text as a certain kind of literary work. So I think in a similarly personal way, the way we encounter these stories can be, we can reflect on that, the versions of the books that we have.
Absolutely.
That's really good.
And I think it's so important, that thing. I mean, it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because often students and particularly applicants will say to me, oh, everyone's view is different and everyone is equal. And you want to say, well, yes, but actually there is something here that you're looking at. It's not just an opinion. You're engaging with an object, a text, and languages. So keep having that conversation with it rather than just saying it makes me feel like this.
Yeah,
because of me. Do you know what I mean? It makes you feel like this because it is the thing it is in some way.
Yeah, brilliant. Are there any other?
There's a question here to Adam about whether Charles Dickens was self-published.
Was that in the chat?
It's in the answered one. Well, we've got some open ones as well. No.
Oh, okay. I'm open. Yeah, great. Thank you for flagging that. Oh, yeah. Adam, would you say that Charles Dickens was self-published? When did it become so frowned upon to be self-published rather than published through a publisher? Interesting. Interesting that we now say, quote, traditionally published, meaning through a publisher, with the implication that to be self-published is modern and only dating back to the advent of the internet. Isn't it more accurate to say that self-publishing is, quote, traditional publishing? Question mark, exclamation point.
That's a great question. I can't actually see it, but that doesn't matter. I got the gist of it. I mean, to publish a text means most basically to make it public. And so any act that puts a text into circulation is an act of publishing or publication. If you think about the 16th and 17th century, people were writing a lot in manuscript, handwritten copies. So when John Donne writes his poems, he doesn't want to go into print because he doesn't want readers to get the wrong end of the stick. So he writes them all out by hand and circulates them to people he knows as an attempt to try and control what happens. But he's certainly publishing his stuff, but not in ways that we would today understand. I guess you could say it's a form of manuscript self-publishing there that's going on. So I think the implication of your question is absolutely right, that publishing as a term and an activity has a history and works in different ways at different times. And Dickens is so entangled with so many forms of self-promotion and self-distribution that I think we could think of founding your own serial and publishing your novel in parts in that same serial as a kind of self-publishing. That's right. But I don't think it didn't carry any of the negative terms it did today. I think we're in a really interesting moment as the status of self-publishing seems to be shifting around as we have these interesting and complicated debates about open access and online publications and alternatives to publishing monopolies. Lots of people are kind of reassessing what it means to publish, or the validity or not of publishing your own thing. I think that's really interesting. I've been looking most recently into the strange and wonderful world of zines, which are kind of contemporary DIY publishing in America and Britain, which are often people writing text and getting access to photocopiers or Xerox machines and stitching them together and then handing them out or selling them for a very small amount of money. I mean, that's publishing. It's not publishing as we would recognize it today, but it's completely interesting and legitimate, I think.
But I also think, I was thinking as you were talking, Adam, at your Emily Dickinson section about, I often give my students a Jane Austen letter to look at, a manuscript letter, partly to get them to see what an odd form it is, cross-writing, that the envelope's folded, all that sort of work. But also then I ask them to think about a letter in the Jane Austen novel we're studying, or a Jane Austen novel, and think about the huge difference that the kind of letter in an as a kind of an element within the novel, how different it is from what we're seeing in Austen's actual letters, which are incredibly chatty, quite random, sort of assume a relationship to readers. So that partly to sort of make people think more about genre and print and how much it maybe not alters, but just presents a different form of the thing that they're, rather than assuming that the letter in the novel is somehow a kind of little lifted gem from the way that people actually wrote letters in the period.
I think that's totally right. Yeah. And that's such a fascinating category of writing, isn't it? The one genre embedded inside another genre. And you're right, it's not a documentary reproduction of an actual letter at all. it becomes a slightly weird, a different thing. It does different kind of work, doesn't it, in a novel? It's a bit like back to Love's Labour's Lost, that has all those sonnets or sonnet-like moments. They both are, and they are not like the sonnets Shakespeare's writing in manuscript at the same time in the 1590s. They have to do a slightly different kind of thing.